before directly addressing my contribution to today's event from my refugee-centric background, I'd like to add to the overall title of Broken Promises. Rereading the Oslo Accords, I always put accords in quotation marks to indicate that I have some question about the definition. It appears clear to me that it is not only that promises were broken, but also that the so-called promises were one-sided and even deceitful, meant to lead to the situation that we confront today, particularly for those Palestinians who continue to live as refugees. The panel summary in our program today notes that the documents under discussion, namely the Oslo Accords of 1993, Oslo I, and 1995, Oslo II, are said to be based on UN Security Council resolutions 242, which called for a just and lasting peace after the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, and 338, which followed the 1973 Yom Kippur War and called again for implementation of the resolution 242. The goal of both the resolutions and the accords was to arrive at a peace treaty which would fulfill, and I quote, the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, and we're still waiting for that. There is, however, no reference in the accords to UN Resolution 194 and the right of refugee return in international law. The summary further states that since reference to the applicability of international humanitarian law to the occupied territories is omitted, the approach to permanent status issues, among them, and you've heard this before and you'll hear it twice from me, among them borders of a future Palestinian state, security, terrorism and self-defense, security based on demographic realities, refugees, their return to Palestine, Jerusalem, and a number of commentaries around mutual recognition and the end of conflict. In most documentation, the phrasing of these issues is very much focused on the imperatives of Israel. Not surprisingly, as Israel, we heard this morning, was and still is noted by all observers without exception to be the stronger party in the negotiations. As the Security Council resolutions were never fully implemented and did not lead to peace, the Accords waited for the next round, the 1978 Camp David Accords, equally in quotation marks. Whence the resolutions and Accords all remained important references in subsequent negotiations to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, and particularly the status and future of Palestine and the role of the Palestinians. None of these exchanges allowed an equal or even a fair role for the Palestinian side, and were a portent of what continues until today, ignoring the crucial importance to the Palestinian people of the so-called permanent status issues, which I repeat, statehood, borders, land, independence, self-determination, settlements, Jerusalem, status, and the right of return, or more broadly, the future of the Palestine refugees, or of the refugees generally. As former Commissioner General of UNRWA, I hope you tolerate my dwelling on refugee considerations, particularly that of the right of return, and other concerns which could and should have been addressed had international humanitarian law been observed in the negotiations. True, IHL, as we call it, is often neglected or ignored or deliberately breached, but rarely so clearly and for so long as in the Israeli-Palestine exchanges, both in Oslo and in Camp David, brokered often by interlocutors who appeared to favor the stronger party. My thoughts are prompted first by decades of unhappily following the fits and starts of Palestinian attempts to achieve independence, and all the thwarted attempts to counter, with dignity, the daily humiliating oppressions of those who live as refugees, but also more personally by my experience of living in Gaza for 10 years, 2000 to 2010, working for the UN agency created in 1949 precisely to address the needs of Palestine refugees. The recent decisions by the United States defunding UNRWA by $300 million and by the PA by $200 million is alarming, painful, and condemnable. But back to the Accords, which barely qualify to this, given this title, since they left many issues referred to as questions to be discussed between the newly created and considerably circumscribed Palestinian Authority, deliberately not a state, therefore not an equal partner in the negotiations, and more specifically to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, as the so-called discussion partner. The latter was at a distinct disadvantage, proven repeatedly by the outcome of the agreements throughout the process. This 25th year anniversary, a word that usually indicates celebration, but not in this case, of the Accords has given rise to a plethora of revisits, most of them noted by unpleasant headlines. For example, U.S. cuts to UNRWA point to the dark future being readied for the Palestinians. Jonathan Cook in Abu Dhabi's newspaper, The National. 25 years on, the Oslo Accords are dead. They served only to advance, entrench, and protect Israel's occupation. And that was subtitled, "Since that fateful handshake between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, the reality on the ground for Palestinians has never been bleaker." That was Joseph Dana in the National of Abu Dhabi. Avi Shleim, Palestinians still live under apartheid in Israel 25 years after the Oslo Accords. That was in The Guardian on the 13th of September this year. And it may be Diana Butu who says it most succinctly in Haaretz, also on September 13th this year, the 25th anniversary date. She said in the headline, "I advised the Palestinian negotiation team. It was a mistake to have negotiated with Israel at all." And then just this past week came out a headline from Yusuf Menayer. You may have seen, I'll show the picture too, so a little color in the top. It says, "Oslo at 25, long dead, and now finally buried." Not wishing to dwell further on a description of the Accord's weaknesses and omissions, I'd rather focus on the provisions which blatantly disadvantage, indeed punish, Palestinians. I do this from my long-held position supporting Palestine refugees and having been head of the organization that was created to ensure decent lives for them, which meant living during a bleak, although nothing to compare with today, in Gaza, 10 years. This punishment results particularly from the absence of mention of Resolution 2994, one of the UN resolutions, by the way, that Madeleine Albright attempted to annul, among others for Palestinians, and the deliberate avoidance, as I've already mentioned, of any reference to dependence on international humanitarian law generally, and particularly on refugee status and treatment. Palestinian refugees became a secondary matter. I gleaned that phrase from Dr. Abdullah when we were discussing what I should talk about today. And when all those they were deferred to the final status talks, and I wonder when those will take place 25 years later. They were set aside at best, the refugees, that is, and ignored at worst. Today we see actions which reflect the practical implications and actions which follow from the prejudices inherent in the Accords. For example, the U.S. government's decrease of the $300 million from its annual funding pledge to UNRWA, diminishing, if not eliminating, education, health, and social services that a government is expected to provide to its citizens. Refugees, particularly those in Gaza, are trapped, are attacked repeatedly, both by word and weapons, for simply trying to demand their rights and defend themselves. In the West Bank, obstacles prevent easy traveling and movement of goods in and out, among other difficulties. In neighboring countries, some Palestine refugees have fared fairly well, as in Jordan and formerly in Syria. But the current discourse, based on the omissions from the Oslo Accords, have led to host governments and the refugees themselves objecting strongly to the governments of the United States, Israel, and others, suggesting that those refugees who've been in other countries, some for decades, should be granted citizenship of those countries. This is easy. If you eliminate the problem, you don't have to find a solution. While both analysts and critics of the Accords suggest that the discussions were not conducted as if between equals, resulting precisely in favoring one side's demands to the complete disadvantage of the Palestinians. In hindsight, one might wonder how the Accord documents 1 and 2, 93, 95 could have been agreed and signed. At least one can now call attention to the necessity of acknowledging the unfortunate outcomes still looming for Palestine and Palestinians, particularly for the Palestinian refugees who remain in limbo 25 years later. Now, not only in limbo, but increasingly disadvantaged, fighting with their meager political resources for their rights, not only to their land, but also to necessities such as water, electricity, education, medical care. The list goes on, if one wants even to compare quality of life in the occupied territories to that of citizens in neighboring independent countries. Even during that somewhat better time when I lived in Gaza, the UNRWA administration spent its time negotiating down to the precise calorie necessary for the number of residents, moving the agreed-upon quantities in and out, just as the movement of the Palestinians themselves, including the non-refugees, had to be negotiated and agreed upon with permissions given, while journeys of both goods and people were planned with no certainty that they would actually be honored when approaching the border crossings. We can discuss at length what the Oslo negotiations neglected and what is missing in the accords, to the increasing disadvantage over the years for the Palestinians. Our concern, however, should be how to deal with what we face today. I think every day about former colleagues, friends, and all others I left behind, in Gaza particularly, and now in Syria as well, and see no feasible attempts to relieve their deprivations and sufferings. Almost all of them are stuck, without permission to leave the Gaza Strip or the means to leave Syria. Their hopes for the future, for their children's well-being, for rescue of any sort in any field decrease day by day. I apologize for being so maudlin, but not for being so pessimistic, as shouldn't we, who are aware of the facts on the ground and in the political arena, who are in a position to defend those who barely have a voice, who are suffering through accidents of geography, be able to propose and act to address these injustices? I admire Memo's attempts to call attention to how and why we've arrived at this juncture, and to bring together speakers and audiences to contemplate ways to address the oversights of and move beyond the Oslo Accords. I very much look forward to the discussions today, hoping to glean ideas from whether there are possibilities to address the current conditions for Palestinians and what can be done today and tomorrow to relieve the plight of the many refugees, particularly those dependent on UNRWA services. Thank you.